Yeah. I'm going to call this forum to order. I'm Greg Hedda. I'm the House Chair of the Higher Education and Employment Advancement Committee. We are conducting this forum as a partnership with the Government Oversight Committee. I think I'll just make a couple of opening remarks and then ask the other chairs and ranking members if they have any opening remarks that they want to make. I think this is an important topic. I think many of us who are so supportive of public higher education in Connecticut are mindful and concerned about the public reputations of the system, of how they're perceived, and especially of public's perception of whether or not the dollars that we invest in public higher education are well spent. I know that those principles are shared by many people in the room. And so we've decided to have this forum so that we can discuss some of the findings that came out of some reports and reviews from late last year and earlier this year. And I hope that by the end of this conversation, we'll have a greater sense of what protections are in place and what we need to do to strengthen those protections, if any. With that said, I'll ask I guess we'll alternate a little bit between committees. I'll see if Senator Gadkar Wilcox has any additional remarks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sujata Gadkar Wilcox, the senator for the 22nd District, representing Bridgeport, Trumbull, and Monroe. I'm also a faculty member at Quinnipiac, so higher education is my background in my field. And I very much, and also as a teacher of democracy, good government, and accountability. So I'm very glad that we're here for this committee meeting. Appreciate the auditors and the state comptroller's office for bringing attention to this and for actually outlining some issues that were raised in the report, and I have some concerns about some of those issues raised. And as a strong advocate for public government, public oversight, transparency, and accountability, particularly for our public institutions, I think it's important, as Representative Haddad said, I think it's important that we have these meetings, and that we have as much transparency and accountability as possible. I'm also a strong advocate of public education, and I want to make sure that we're all sharing. We're here really with the same goal, which is to strengthen public education, and to make sure that the dollars spent are spent on our students, to the in a way that's the most effective, the most efficient, and that will help support programs that create access points. My father actually grew up really poor in India and was able to come to the United States because of access to education. My whole career has been spent on providing students that access to education. So strengthening our public education system is extremely important to me, and I don't want to miss that goal here. That these dollars have to be invested in public education. I want to thank all of the faculty members that do what they can with the resources that they have, and I'm hoping that we can find ways to support them as well. Public education is where students get that access opportunity, especially those from underserved communities, from under-resourced communities, those who are underrepresented, to be able to then launch into careers that help them change not only their own lives, but change the lives of their families for generations to come. And so I wanted to make sure, I know we're all on the same page here, as we're mentioning, as we're sort of keeping in mind the issues of transparency and accountability, how we can then also focus on the goal of strengthening public education and higher education. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. I'll ask Senator Slapp if you have any comments.
Thank you, Representative. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad that we're having this joint committee hearing. It comes at a very important time as we're contemplating investing as a state hundreds of millions of dollars, hopefully additional funds in our public universities. And we have Senate Bill 5 as well, where we're contemplating adding significant investment in our public scholarships for public and private schools. So we want to make those investments, but we need to know that our resources are being used wisely and efficiently. Everyone in the state of Connecticut has a stake in this. The taxpayer, who sees their check a little bit smaller than it would be otherwise because they're making an investment in public education. Certainly the parents who are maybe taking a second job or cutting back on vacations or doing whatever to get their child through school. And then the student who may be going into debt, in order to finance their education. All these dollars, we all believe, I know everyone on this committee believes that every single one of these dollars are precious. They're really precious, and they need to be spent with one kind of North Star in mind, and that is what is best for student outcomes. So that's the lens that I'm going to have and be using when it comes to this hearing. And I appreciate my colleagues here ready, I know, to ask some important questions, and hopefully we can determine, do we have the right fiscal controls in place? What improvements can be made? And again, most importantly, what can we do to improve and sustain good student outcomes? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Slapp. Representative Dathan.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I am happy to be part of this panel. I bring my 30 years of experience of a finance person. I started my career in public accounting, auditing companies and looking at internal controls, looking at deficiencies in internal controls. And so, it was very interesting to read this report. Um, I'm just going to reiterate what everyone said about higher ed and public higher ed in particular. It is a really cornerstone of our future in Connecticut. And what we invest in our youth for today will pay great dividends for tomorrow. I want to thank the governor and the comptroller for their diligent work and in looking at this situation. I want to thank the auditors for their detailed review of all of these transactions, which sounds like a lot. and really wanted to thank the faculty and staff who sadly are, having unsavory sort of let's see, best word here, unsavory sort of reactions. People are feeling that, we should make sure that um, all of these transactions, that are done in accordance. And, we have a whole bunch of students and faculty who work so hard to improve their situation and teach the students and make sure that these students have good outcomes. And sadly, I fear that some of the messaging here reflects badly on everyone, and a deficiency in the system. And I do not feel that that is a situation. I think our teachers and our students are doing a wonderful job. And I do feel like we need to investigate what's happening at the top. So I appreciate the opportunity to be in this and look at how we can improve student outcomes in this continuing discussion. I know many of us sit on the Higher Ed Sustainability Task Force, and this is something we've talked about there as well. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if the ranking members have any remarks that they'd like to make as well. Yes, no, no, no. I see Representative Carney is online. If he would like to make any opening statements, there he is. Yeah, would you like to say anything, Representative Carney? Yes.
Thank you very much, Representative Haddad. I want to thank the leadership on both committees for putting together this forum, and the state auditors for their extra focus on this issue. It's been said, but this is extremely important to the state and extremely important to our youth, to ensure that the state university system is thriving and is under competent leadership that's focused on improving enrollment, improving the schools, and I hope we can shed some light on some of the more controversial things that have come out in the auditor's report and in the media. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Carney. Just by way of explanation, I'll say that this was originally envisioned as a 2-hour forum. We'll hear a panel from the comptroller's office. We'll hear from our state auditors. We'll hear from folks from the state university system as well. I'm looking at the time. I feel like we're already 15 minutes late, but that's okay. There's some flexibility in the end time, not much. We have a higher education public hearing that's noticed for 1:30. We'll try to accommodate that if we go a little long, but hopefully we can stay within our time frame. And so with that, I'll move on to introduce the comptroller of the state of Connecticut, Sean Scanlon. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you could introduce your staff you brought with us, and then as I understand it, you have a short sort of PowerPoint presentation that you want to make. And that will just give us an opportunity to ask you some additional questions if there are any about your findings. Welcome to the forum.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. As a recovering legislator, I will do my best to get us back on time, having the perspective of what it means to be off time here. I've been joined this morning by two senior leaders from our team. To my immediate right is Mike Delaney, who runs the BFA unit of our team, and then Beth Mesha, who is the division director for the accounts payable division. These two individuals worked very hard with members of their team on the special examination that the comptroller's office performed at the request of Governor Lamont last year. And with the permission of the chair, what we'd like to do is to pull up the PowerPoint presentation that we have. It's very short, which goes over the findings that our office found as a result of that examination, and then talk a little bit about our thoughts about the bill that higher education has raised, and then, of course, be here to answer any and all questions that you have. So if we can pull up the PowerPoint, that'd be great. really going to test my need for glasses on this very small screen without having to awkwardly turn behind me. But next slide, please. In the Connecticut General Statutes, the governor has the power to order the comptroller to perform a special audit of any state agency. And in the wake of some reporting done by Hearst, the governor asked me and our team to examine financial records, practices, and procedures to identify violations in October. Given the context of the system's recent financial concerns and tuition hikes, it's crucial that we believe that the university leadership be spending taxpayer and tuition funds appropriately. And he tasked our office to look into what was happening at CSCU, but also to put forward some recommendations of how we can improve what it is that we had discovered. Next slide. Our team reviewed thousands of procurement card, known as P card transactions between July of 2021 and October of 2024, and the related university policies and procedures associated with both those cards and just the overall management of the system. We reviewed tax documents, vehicle usage logs, and records in the system's financial platform, which is called Banner. You'll hear that referred to several times today. That is their system-wide financial platform. This review included comparing financial records provided by CSCU with transaction data from the state's P card vendor, which at the time was JP Morgan, for the system's 1,070 issued P cards. Our post-audit of transactions to identify those violations of system policies included a sample of over 1,000 transactions across 76 billing cycles and focused on leadership and purchasing staff at the institutions below. Why only 1,000? It would take us years, and that's not an understatement, to have reviewed everything that was spent and purchased between the period of time that the governor asked us to look at, which is about a 3.5-year period of time. We chose to do a random sampling of 1,000, and we believe that we put together enough of a random sample to be able to sort of get a feel for what was happening there that could be extrapolated. And it took us several months to look at just those 1,000, but we do believe that 1,000 was representative enough for us to learn enough to put forward the recommendations in the report that we did. Next slide. So the major findings of this report were that, number one, CSCU lacked a uniform system-wide purchasing policy, and limits and other guidelines on P-card spending had carve-outs for senior leadership. While most of the chancellor's spending, which was the initial impetus of our investigation, we reviewed fell within the loose policies that were currently in place, many of the transactions were in fact excessive and inconsistent with the financial realities that the chair has just discussed at the beginning of this hearing. And many of the transactions that we reviewed across all staff and leadership had incomplete or missing documentation, were for restricted purposes, or they did violate university policy. Next slide. We looked at the chancellor's spending, again, at the direction of the governor, but we also looked at the general senior leadership spending as well. If somebody could get rid of that calendar notification, that would be great. No. Okay. So what we primarily looked at was some of the things that had been featured in the report that came out in October, focused on meals in particularly and transportation. Between July of 2021, thank you, and October of 2024, 70% of the chancellor's purchases were on dining, and 43% of these meals had receipts that were either missing or not itemized. While there is a $50 limit on food for most university staff, current policy allows the chancellor to exceed that threshold at his or her own discretion. And in another finding, the chancellor had used a car service several times despite having access to a state vehicle. Next slide. Other members of senior leadership at the CSCU system spent even further amounts of money. For example, the interim president of Southern Connecticut State University spent $47,000 over a 16-month period of time, significantly more than any of his peers. Many of the transactions we reviewed did not have the adequate documentation and were found to have violated state policy. In another example, this, of course, was not nefarious, nor was any of this nefarious, by the way. The president of Charter Oak College, together with his marketing director, charged nearly $500,000 on a P card for online advertising. Again, something that is just completely not appropriate to be using one of these cards for, but nevertheless was being done and not properly either monitored or captured until we had done our audit. Next slide. We did not want to put out this report in a vacuum or without any recommendations, given that our office works in this space each and every day. And so we put out 10 recommendations that I will not read here. Almost all of them made it into a bill that the Higher Education Committee has raised this session, and they have even gone beyond that. And for that, I am grateful to the two chairs today for their leadership on this, and we can get into that in a moment. But these 10 recommendations were done as a result of the things that we read and as a result of our main takeaway of this, which of course was that while none of the behavior that we found warranted in our minds a criminal referral, they certainly were things that were clear that there was not the right policies and procedures in place for the university system to be the kind of financial stewards that I know they want to be of the taxpayer dollars that they receive. And I think with the recommendations that are in the higher education bill that the committee is working on, I believe that we can restore the faith of the taxpayer, that the systems are in place for them to be the stewards of that money that they want to be. Even though we have commitments from the current Board of Regents chair and the chancellor to endeavor to be better at this, they will not always be in their positions. And I think we owe it to the people of Connecticut and the taxpayers of the state to put those into state law so that no matter who holds those jobs, they can be sure that there is accountability, that there are procedures in place to do this the right way, and that more importantly, the people of Connecticut can have insight into this through the systems and the transparency that we have at the Comptroller's office, where they can see exactly what is being spent and how. Next slide. Only other consideration I would read here is that we had from day one full and complete cooperation of the CSU system, and I thank them for that. I thank you for all of your attention today. And before we open it up to questions, which I know are important, I do want to just make some comments on the bill before the Higher Education Committee, though I know this is not a public hearing today. It's an informational hearing about the topic, and I would just like to share some thoughts. Again, grateful for them to raise HB 6887, an act concerning higher education management and fiscal accountability. Section 1 implements almost all of our recommendations. We're grateful for that. There are some that are not in there that I just want to raise for the committee's attention that we felt were important. First of which was that I certainly understand, having learned a bit about higher ed during this proposal, or this process rather, that some of the things that were happening are part of a culture of higher education, and I understand that. However, we urge both the CSCU system and the University of Connecticut, which is in Section 2, to try to utilize wherever possible the use of foundation credit cards instead of taxpayer-funded credit cards. If the donors of these institutions would like to support the behavior and things that folks may feel are necessary parts of their job, then it should perhaps be paid for by donors and not taxpayers. Second, the Section 2 requires the same reforms of Section 1 of the CSCU system for UConn. We fully support that and think that that is a very good idea and proposal. Number 3, it requires the Board of Regents to establish an internal audit office and for OSC to conduct random post audits of this. One of the unfortunate things that we learned during this process was that the CSCU internal audit unit was disbanded in 2017 as part of a cost-cutting measure. In my mind, I'm biased as the comptroller. An internal audit unit is obviously one of the last places I would ever urge anyone to cost cut. because that is the exact unit that would be helping you do that work. And to bring that back and require in statute that the CSU system has that, I think is a very, very strong recommendation. And finally, I just want to touch on another concept that is in the bill, which would require the CSCU units to fully implement Core CT for their accounting and financial reporting systems. Core CT is the state's enterprise management system. It performs similar functions of the CSCU banner system. But I will caution that while it sounds like an easy fix, to do this is very, very difficult and very, very expensive. Our initial estimate to include all of this into Core CT is $25 million. And I know there are other hearings go on today about the budget. I don't think that they have that laying around. It certainly would be a good use of money, in my opinion, and I would support it. But if that is not something that we have the budget to do this year, we do believe that there is another path for us to do this by building a bridge for reporting between Banner and Core for the purposes of gaining that line of sight for auditing their financials and to make that available to the people of Connecticut through our Open Connecticut website. So I will stop there. Thank the committee and the chairs again for their attention today. And myself, Michael, and Beth are here to answer any and all questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller, for that testimony. We appreciate your recommendations and your work and the work of folks in your office. It's helpful to us to sort of understand what's going on, where we should go. I would just point out to members a couple things. One is, yeah, I think during this informational hearing, we'll limit folks to just 1 or 2 questions if possible, so that we can move through the panels as efficiently as possible. And in that vein, I'm just going to ask you one question. It picks up on what you had mentioned last, which is Core CT and really trying to share information sort of to make sure that it's as transparent as possible. The current statute actually sort of which I think was enacted in 2011, just after I joined the legislature. Asks is sort of a weak version of a request to have the system and the comptroller's office and the Office of Policy Management work together to accomplish the goal that you just suggested. I think the reason why the language is specific to the way it is because of the hurdles that you mentioned in your testimony. It's, I guess, the Banner system is a finance system specifically designed for higher ed institutions. It gives them greater ability to track their own revenue streams and expenditures. It does not seem easily compatible with Core, but I presume that what you're suggesting is that there's a way to generate a report on a regular basis to sort of export information around expenditures that can then be imported maybe into Core CT so that we keep, so we have the best of both worlds. Is that essentially where, and my understanding as well is that personal services is already in Core CT. Can you just explain briefly, if you could, what's on Core now and what is not?
I'll turn it over to Mike and Beth for a more technical explanation than the one that I will probably give you right now. But I would just say your initial premise, Representative, is correct. I do think that there is a way for us to do this that doesn't cost $25 million and within the available appropriations and resources that my office currently has, in addition to CSCU. Chairman Gway of the Board of Regents has given me his commitment to work on this. I believe I have the chancellors as well, and our teams will work together in the coming weeks and months to find a way to do this within available appropriations.
Thank you. And I presume that once that data is sort of conveyed, that then it can also be posted on the transparency.gov website and publicly accessible to all?
The goal is to get all of the information onto the Open Connecticut portal and platform, which is easily sortable to people who want to do that.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I'm going to ask Senator Gadkar Wilcox.
Thank you so much, Comptroller Scanlon, for being here this morning. I have A question, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the distinction between perhaps unauthorized spending and then what it seemed like in your report were many instances of sort of just improper coding or improper. And that's really important because I want to make sure the public kind of understands. Uh, in my mind, one is much worse if it's unauthorized. But for example, that $500,000 charge, it seemed like that wasn't an authorized charge. It was just improperly charged to an account that it should have been charged to. So my question is just distinguishing between the two. What percentage of the funding, that sort of improper funding, what percentage was actually unauthorized, so not permissible at all, versus this was miscategorized, like it shouldn't have been on the P card, it should have been spent from the foundation account, which to me is much less severe than, oh, it was completely unauthorized. So what percentage of that improper funding was unauthorized spending and what percentage was like miscategorized?
Going to defer to Beth and Mike.
Elizabeth Mesha with the Office of State Comptroller. The percentage of actual violations of policies were fairly small. The highest issues we saw were with missing or incomplete documentation, which is critical in determining whether or not a purchase is appropriate. If you don't have the detail of the purchase, you can't determine if it fits in the policy. The issue with the advertising, the 500,000, the P card is meant for more routine, smaller transactions. When you're dealing with a purchase of that size, there's additional protections in place going through the regular procurement process, as well as a reconciliation of those types of charges. P card in that case was used so that the charges were automatically coming through periodically. And in the information we got, we did not receive backup documenting any reconciliation of those charges.
Okay, great. That's helpful. So a majority of those are actually authorized. They were just miscoded or charged improperly.
They weren't clearly defined because they
were
didn't
also
have
included.
appropriate backup.
Okay, so better, more account. Okay, that to me, those are different categories, so that's less alarming, and I appreciate that. And then, so of the percentage that you thought was entirely unauthorized, so that wouldn't have been spent, or what percentage of the budget would you say that is? And those are my two questions.
Mike Delane, Director of Budget and Financial Analysis. We can get you that information. We don't have it with us right now.
And Senator, I would also remind you and members of the committee that this was a 1,000 sample of transactions. It was not the entirety of all their transactions. So it would be hard to say what percentage totally it was, but we can give the percentage of the 1,000 that we looked at for sure.
Representative Dathan.
Thank you very much. I am going to have a very difficult time leaving it to one question, so I may do my old appropriations and get two in one, and then provide a list of questions because there's more than just the one. One of the things I was thinking of when I looked at your 1,000 transactions that you looked at here, there was, according to the full report, kind of like a page and a half of findings. So of the 1,031 transactions, 628 of them had irregularities, which is a 61% error rate. If you extrapolate that against the whole population, it could be very, very large. Have you made any recommendations to the finance team within the CSCU system that they delve into these and provide more research to see really what the error rate is? I mean, if this was my public accounting days and you had a 61% error rate, you would extend and review more and understand the time limitations that you all were on. I found that number pretty concerning.
Yes, I think we would agree that it was a concerning number and that what we found was concerning as well. And that is why I am grateful to the chair of the Board of Regents for bringing his team into our office shortly after this report was put out in December, and for his commitment to working with us both to look at what had happened in the past and to prevent this from happening again in the future. And while we did only have a small sample, I think you are correct, Representative, that of a sample of that size to have that many have problems, again, not anything that was typically nefarious, mostly just because there was a lack of policies and procedures, and then also a lack of training on what policies and procedures were in place, that I think you saw that many problems in the sample size that we looked at, and that could be extrapolated, yes, to other transactions as well.
As a follow-on, with the irregularities, if there are irregularities for, let's say, not producing enough documentation, that is in against IRS regulations. So in effect, that would have to be a taxable benefit to the individual, especially when you're talking about like mileage and other sort of things. If there's not adequate mileage laws or proof of spending, the IRS will not allow that deduction. And therefore, you would have to adjust the person's W-2 to reflect that as compensation. Is the Chancellor's office looking at that, or is that going to be done by the CSCU Finance Department?
Turn over to Mike and Beth for that.
We supplied them with the information that we had, but we are not aware if they are looking into making those tax adjustments.
Thank you very much. I would love to hear from CSCU and what they're going to be doing. I will, if there is time, I'd love to ask more questions, but I'm going to let my colleagues ask.
Thank you, Representative Dathan. Senator Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions. Seeing as how the bulk of the spending, particularly the Chancellor's spending, was on food, and you mentioned that generally there's a $50 cap, but certainly there's a component of discretionary spending there. There was a recommendation I see from your office to use foundation dollars, but when not available, set perhaps a larger cap, for those networking instances. What I would wonder is whether or not there's a system of pre-authorization in place now, and if not, for spending above the $50 limit. If not, would that be a recommendation from the office? And is there sort of a hierarchy or some sort of system in place for the Chancellor's office or other leadership to go to for pre-authorization of that sort of spending?
Thank you, Senator. In the fourth recommendation of our recommendations and included in the higher education bill, we call for a secondary review and sign off to be required to ensure that the exception to the policy is warranted and that somebody is looking at that more than just saying it's not applicable to me. And that policy would also deter any misuse of the exception to the spending limit in place. And grateful again to the committee for putting that in the bill.
And who is that secondary sign off? Is that in place now, or is that just a recommendation?
It is not in, I mean, it's a recommendation and it is in place in some institutions, I believe, but not in all. And this would be to be uniform across the system, but Mike is nodding. So I'm going to, yes.
Okay. And my second question is with respect to spending like the $500,000 in advertising spending, what is the appropriate procedure for spending advertising dollars for the university?
Beth would love to answer this question.
There should be a purchase order in place and contract documentations, as well as it shouldn't be put on a president's card, for example. It should be going through the business office so that the people who regularly handle those types of transactions are handling that as well. And the response from the school in particular was that this vendor wouldn't accept anything other than P cards. So we are working with them to find a solution that meets both the vendor needs and has good policy in place.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Cohen. I'm going to ask, we'll call on Representative Farrar, followed by Representative Carney.
Thank you to the chair. Thanks, Comptroller, for being with us. I did want to follow up about one of the recommendations that we haven't fully touched on yet, which is around the residency requirement for system and university leadership. I know that the auditor's report particularly highlighted that the chancellor's employment contract had expected a move to Connecticut, which didn't seem to occur, and there was concern about us outlaying moving expenses that also weren't fully repaid. Does your recommendations kind of get into that in more depth? And I'm curious why you all pursued this residency requirement.
Thank you, Representative. I believe just fundamentally that the people who lead our institution should be residing in the state of Connecticut, and there are current executive branch authority to enforce residency requirements under the current general statutes 5-231 for selected classes of employee. And we made the recommendation not just because of what we had found and what was documented in our report about the current leadership's housing situation, but just more out of a recommendation that in future, everything we wanted to put forward here was not just about one individual or one leader, but more about the institution. And the students that go to that institution are going there because it is the state university system. And I just fundamentally believe that the people who lead that institution should reside here in the state of Connecticut.
Thank you. And just clarifying about the relocation expenses, which I think were maybe partially repaid to the state. Were those fully repaid to the state from your knowledge?
Mike or Beth?
We don't have knowledge on that. That was something that the auditors of public accounts reviewed, and I believe their report said that it was something in process.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I look forward to finding more about that. And thank you to the comptroller for your work on this. Thank you to the chair.
Thank you, Representative for our Representative Carney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Comptroller, for your report and your remarks. I agree with you on the last one. I think people should reside in the state if they're leading a state university system. But my question, one of the things you mentioned was about the, I guess, the CCSU Foundation. There's also one for the community colleges. And I recall when I was first elected and on the higher ed committee, we had a discussion about the Yukon Foundation, and there was really no way to see what was in there, what was being spent on, things like that. So I guess is the state allowed to open the books for the CCSU Foundation to figure out what it's spending its funds on, and if there's any regulations around that?
Thank you, Representative. To my knowledge, there is no ability for us to do that.
Okay. No, and just a quick follow-up. I mean, is there any potential? I mean, we'd need to change the law, but would that be a potential, I guess, recommendation on behalf of the comptroller to have access to those books and for the purpose of this investigation, or is that not possible?
Representative, my recommendation was solely that for instances such as meals or entertaining people, that the foundation credit cards be utilized for that type of entertainment versus a state procurement card. We did not get into recommendations of opening up those accounts. I think that would be a separate conversation, and I'm not so sure that in this situation that would change anything. The focus of our report was the concerns of people in the public having read about some of the expenses that occurred on those cards that they, in theory, as taxpayers, were paying for. I don't know that they would have as much concern if people who were willingly giving donations to institutions of higher education were then using those in the furtherance of recruitment or retention or networking and things of that matter. So I don't know that would be directly one-to-one applicable to this situation, but I do think it would be if we said, hey, they should be using that to go to a restaurant or to go to a concert or to do things like that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Carney. there any additional questions? Senator Slapp.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller, and thank you, Mr. Chair. There is a saying, it's not mine, that says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. You probably heard that before. How confident are you if these recommendations that you made, and we're going to add others as well, we've gotten some from the governor's office and from colleagues on both sides of the aisle, that we're able to pass these and act them into law, that'll take care of the issue? Or is this more of a culture issue, in your opinion?
I think there is certainly a culture issue. And I am a firm believer that systems should be in place regardless of who holds positions of power. I think our entire country is predicated upon that being the foundation of our society. And that if good leaders adhere to the rules and the laws that they are being governed by, that the systems in place are going to do their job. But I do think that leadership really matters. And so I take the Board of Regents and the Chancellor at their word that they want to do better. And my office is always available and willing any day, anytime, to sit down with whoever holds those leadership positions to work to implement real change that I think can restore the confidence that is necessary, given the public reporting about this. And I think that we've already begun to do that. I think passing this law will do that, but this is not something that can be changed overnight. And it's something that has to be happening over time. And I certainly am ready to be a part of that. And I hope that others are as well that are entrusted with this incredible responsibility.
Representative Gucker.
Good afternoon, Sean. Great seeing you again. Usually not at an event, but actually doing your official business. So I thank you for being here. Is there a reason why your office didn't review the Chancellor's office card about the $83,000? Because it is shown in the report.
Representative, if you want to clarify that question about.
Just wondering why, it's shown in the report and we're not really seeing information as to what was in there, what was reviewed, what was shown.
Representative, so we did a sample of spending across the system because it would have taken us years to go through every single transaction that was done at all the levels by all the different people with a P card. So the report is sampling of what we found, not the whole picture of it.
All right, so I'm guessing you're just looking at the P card and not at the others. And I understand there's quite a lot of work there to be looking at. But that is the reasoning why.
Yes. Any further answer, Mike or Beth? No.
All right, thank you.
Any additional questions? Representative Dathan, you're the winner. You get 2 more questions.
Yay.
Close us out.
So in the auditor's report, they indicate that the CSCU Board of Regents Audit Committee is charged with conducting an annual review of the president, now chancellor's expenses as stipulated in the charter. As part of your review, did you look for evidence of those sort of meetings?
We did not in our review. We focused more on the financial transactions piece of it and the controls in relation to the P card transactions.
Got it. Can I ask another one? Also in the audit report, and I'm going to follow up with them as well, there is a purchasing card policy and procedures manual that they said should be required. In my understanding, every employee that is issued one of those cards is given the full policy and they have to agree to the policy terms and procedures before spending on that card. Is that correct? And did you look for those in the sample transactions? Did you double check that the person who had that card actually signed off on those procedures when they got the card?
That was not part of the scope of what we looked at. We focused strictly on the transactions.
So substantive testing rather than, okay, got it.
But Beth, can you perhaps speak to when a card is issued, what is a P card recipient or holder informed of?
P card is issued, the person who receives the card does have to sign a user agreement, which requires them to abide by the policy. They should be given a copy of the institution's policy and a training as far as what they should and shouldn't use the card for.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I see Representative Carney has his hand up. I think I will officially declare you the last questioner, Representative Carney, and then we'll move on to the state auditors. Representative Carney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually don't have a question. I just have a quick comment. In my questions to Comptroller Scanlon, I, in error, referenced the Central Connecticut State University Foundation when I meant to say the Connecticut State Colleges and University Foundation. So I just wanted to correct that.
Thank you for that clarification. And with that, I'll just ask one last question, just for your indulgence. We have a public hearing that begins maybe at 1:30. It looks like it might go a little later than that. On the legislation, you referenced the legislation. Just wanted to affirm that we'll take your comments, your submitted testimony, and incorporate that into the record of the public hearing, and that'll, I think, expedite make sure the process will allow us to take your comments into consideration and be part of the official record.
Thank you, Representative. And
Yeah.
thank you to the members of the committee for your time today.
Thank you. And with that, we'll ask the auditors to join us. Mr. Garagosian, Mr. Minor. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to hearing your perspective, and I see you brought several members of their team. If they do answer a question, if they could just be sure, if you want to, you can introduce them at the top, but when if they do answer a question, they should reintroduce themselves as well.
I would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, I'm John Garagosian, joined by the newest state auditor. You might recognize him from around the building, Craig Minor, our deputy state auditor, Lisa Daly, Rebecca Balkin, who heads up our higher education audit unit, and Andrew Collins, who worked on this report. Both Andrew and Rebecca are proud CSU graduates. So this report was a result of a request from Senator Harding for us to look at, to conduct an audit of, particularly on focus of executive leadership at CSU. The review focused on 5 CSU purchasing cards, P cards, as we've been told. Our review looked at all activity on the chancellor's 2 cards, the chancellor's office card that the chancellor had access to, and the 2 cards issued to the vice chancellor. We also examined issues related to the chancellor's employment agreement, and those included housing and entertainment, stipend, moving, temporary living expenses, vehicle, and payroll. To conduct this review, we obtained the chancellor's employment contract, reviewed expectations for both parties, and examined various stipends and entitlements to ensure CSCU appropriately paid and reimbursed the chancellor. Our review focused on whether the CSCU and the chancellor complied with the purchasing card manual, which we link in our electronic testimony, and the chancellor's employment agreement. Our review found meals exceeding the established $50 per person limit, including taxes and tip, a lack of support for purchases, including missing receipts, incomplete or missing lists of meal attendees, lack of documentation to support the reason for certain purchases. Certain purchases, prohibited items, most notably alcohol at meals, and a couple of purchased items delivered to personal residences, which is forbidden by the policy. We commend the Office of State Comptroller for their review. While the scope of our reports is slightly different, we found similar issues. There are certain findings unique to our report. We found CSCU used the P card to pay for a $263 hotel charges for a guest to attend a function in Washington, D.C., which did not appear to be CSCU related. 4 transportation charges totaling $2,290 for a Board of Regents member to attend a meeting in Hartford. Additional transportation charges for the chancellor. We noted $5,014 on the chancellor's office card besides the $490 on his card. Untimely reconciliations of card activity. An issue with the chancellor's rental reimbursement in which he may have been owed $1,755 for 1 month's rent. And as mentioned, CSCU made 22 duplicate payments of $957.85 to the chancellor for his housing allowance. The overpayment occurred because CSCU established the payment as both regular pay and additional pay coded to the home office stipend. We understand the chancellor is repaying those funds. And then lastly, missing annual Board of Regents audits of the chancellor's P card activity. My understanding is we requested those reports and we were not provided with them. We had 4 recommendations related to this report. That the CSCU should update its purchasing card policy and procedure manual to specify guidelines for senior leadership, including the chancellor. That CSCU should ensure that employees perform and enforce monitoring measures in purchasing card policy and procedure manual. The Board of Regents for Higher Education should periodically review expenditures and other activities related to chancellor, university president, and other senior leadership, and document that it communicated the results of those reviews. And lastly, the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities should update its purchasing card manual to address the issue of tipping and what's appropriate for tipping. Because you know from our report, there's no set policy in what the appropriate level of tipping is. So we didn't necessarily have any recommendations related to that other than establishing one. So thank you for your time, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you for your presentation and your recommendations. Just so that I am clear on the scope of your report, you limited yourself to reviewing the P card and other purchases done at the CSCU system office, but didn't go and look at some of the stuff that was included in the comptroller's office that would have happened at any of the specific institutions in the system, correct?
That's correct. The request was limited to the executive leadership in the CSU office.
Yep. And so when you refer to the policy, you're referring to policies that apply just to the CSCU system office. Would it be also, and I don't know if you can answer this question, but maybe best posed to the next panel, but is there a different policy at work at each of the institutions? In other words, there are 6 institutions that fall under the system office. They're all individually accredited institutions. I imagine they may have their own separate policies. I'm just trying to figure out if this policy applies to all of the institutions system-wide, or if this policy applies just to the folks who are categorized as a system office employee.
Andrew, you want to try to answer that question?
So each of the state universities does have its own purchasing card policy in place. The various policies have a lot of parallels to them, but they do decide their own.
And just in terms of compliance or, some sort of review, each institution may have its own method for determining whether the purchases are in compliance with their individual policies. Or is that a function that falls to the system office to determine whether or not the purchases at an individual institution comply with an individual institution's policy? I'm just trying to get a lay of the land, I guess.
In my experience, I would say that each institution would determine the appropriateness of purchases made on P cards.
Thank you for answering those questions. I'll probably pose similar questions later on. Are there additional questions? Representative Dathan.
Thank you very much. I know this was a limited procedure audit rather than a full-blown audit. Generally, when you do an audit, and there's several on your website of the different colleges within the system, do you do a review of system controls and risk assessments? In particularly looking at sort of fraud risk assessments as part of your generally accepted auditing standards under PACOB, I think it is.
We use risk assessment procedures when we're starting any audit and the risk of certain transactions. Rebecca can maybe speak to how we handle the state universities in each individual college versus.
Sure. In any audit, Rebecca Balkin, I oversee higher education. In any audit, we look at internal controls when we first get to a university or an agency. We always meet with the agency staff and we update controls if anything has changed since the last audit. So that's what we base our testing on. If anything has changed, if anything is new, we focus our efforts. As John said, it's risk-based. So we would analyze that in our planning phase, and then we would perform our testing accordingly.
So when you did the audit, a normal sort of financial audit of the whole CSCU system, in particular the central office, in your risk assessment review, did you determine that there was any issues in assessing fraud risk as part of your analyses?
Well, fraud risk, we look at during every audit as well. We meet with various agency employees and we do, that's a required piece of our audit. For this, just to give you a little overview of what we do, for expenditures in general, anytime we do an audit, we normally look at P cards. So this is something that we would normally look at, not in this 100% of the transactions like we did in this scope, but we would normally look at expenditures overall and see if there was a large increase, and again, risk-based, and we would perform testing normally as part of our P card.
But you didn't determine in your risk assessment that there was any risk of fraud or any
So,
sort of.
not in the past. I can get back to you on that. The last CSU system office is currently in management review. So this is separate. I don't know what their risk assessment procedures were. I know that they were performed. I don't know specifically in regards to the P card.
Okay. I guess, when I was looking, you guys did a lot of testing. And it looks like with each card, there were 90% exception rates in each card with reconciliations that were done. That's pretty high, in my opinion, for this. And when looking at the dollar amounts, it was over half the dollar amounts in some of the cards that we found that issues were determined. I guess, the key issue there is with these sort of issues where we don't have adequate documentation, going to back what I was asking earlier in regards to sort of IRS requirements and what we need to have for IRS. Is there any sort of onus that if there are exceptions and we don't have all of the reports needed, that those would be deemed to be personal expenses, or are they able still to be deducted under IRS regulations?
I think that question would probably better be posed to CSCU. We don't really get into the employee benefit piece of it as far as IRS implications. We just look at agency controls, state statutes for compliance. We don't really get into the IRS guidelines as far as pay.
Thank you. One more. A couple.
Thank you for holding your question until the end. Senator Gedgar Wilcox.
I just have one quick question about the report. It says that there were 8 instances for reconciliations in which the system office didn't provide reconciliations upon your request for documentation. Was that subsequently provided, and what is the amount in question there?
Well, I personally did not receive those that were missing, which is why it's reported here.
Senator Slapp.
Thank you. Good to see you both. Good afternoon. I want to ask how often your office audits each state agency or constituent unit. And the reason I'm asking is there's been a lot of dismay expressed by the comptroller, by myself, by others, that the internal auditing department had been left to kind of be disbanded, right, at the central office. And I think it's important, and I'd love to hear your comments about why your office is not sufficient, right, to enforce and to monitor controls. I mean, imagine it's once every few years. Maybe if you could kind of speak to that and how, your oversight works, in comparison to the internal oversight that each of the units are supposed to have. I hope that question makes sense.
Well, we audit state and quasi-public agencies approximately every 2 years. We would never argue against the robust internal audit function. We work with we interact with the auditors at these agencies. UConn is one, for instance, that has a internal audit function. So we would support more internal auditing across the agencies. I think the big difference is we're like historians. We look backwards, and whereas internal auditors could more support the agencies in real time. And I don't know if you want to add anything, Lisa, to that.
Lisa Daly, Deputy State Auditor. As far as internal audits, they're very helpful to each agency, but we have to be careful because we have to make sure that we retain our independence. We cannot be part of their internal controls as they're processing transactions.
That's helpful. Thank you. And Mr. Chair, if I may, just one more question, then I'll toss it back to you. There were some purchases that you identified that were prohibited. And I'm just wondering what would make them. In some cases, you said there's just lack of documentation that might make them okay, essentially. And room service was one, alcohol was another, and then clothing was another that you identified in your audit. So I'm just wondering if you know off the top of your head, what explanations would make those allowable expenses?
Well, I mean, I know the issue of the clothing, it wasn't clear from the documentation as to what it was for. There are what can be deemed appropriate purchases of clothing. Say you were buying shirts for recruiting purposes or something like that, or uniforms for that matter. But in this case, there was a lack of documentation. Alcohol, I don't think is ever permitted, but so do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit. So the appropriateness of these purchases is determined by the policy in place. So alcohol obviously is prohibited. Buying clothes is prohibited. I believe the intent of the policy is to prohibit personal clothing, but with the lack of more detailed documentation, we had to kind of just flag it as being potentially inappropriate. I don't know if there's any other examples we want to discuss or any other specific questions.
The only other one I had was room service. I've literally never ordered room service. So
room service is
I'm
explicitly
just curious how that
prohibited
works.
by the P card policy, since I believe it's more of a personal type purchase rather than something that's related to a state business purpose.
Representative Farrar.
Thank you to the chair. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm hoping to follow up on something I hope wasn't asked yet, which is about the housing allowance payments. I had asked the comptroller a bit about that and was hoping you all could speak to that. Since I do see in your update that given these duplicate payments were provided, 22 in fact, so not just a couple, from your standpoint, this clearly was not a P card issue. Why did this occur? And in your recommendations, what would address this from occurring again?
I think it was just an error that they basically double counted for it in regular pay and then at housing stipend pay. But if I'm
Yeah, so the chancellor was entitled to the housing allowance. The way that it was set up in core, it was set up twice, initially as regular pay item, like your, regular hours, vacation, sick, that goes as regular pay. Additional payments that you get as a stipend are coded as additional pay items. And so the error was that for a while, it was originally set up as an additional pay rather than the stipend. And then when they corrected it to make the stipend, they didn't take it out of the additional pay. So there was a double counting for a while.
Okay, thank you for that. And your summary, thank you, that you provided us says that the chancellor is repaying the extra funds. Do you have any information about the timetable on there or when they'll be repaid to the state?
They can probably speak better to this, but I believe there was a couple different errors that had occurred just in payroll matters. So I believe it was pushed back a year to maybe 2026. I believe it'll be fully repaid. There were some changes to the repayment terms.
Okay,
So
thank you for sharing what you know, and I'll certainly ask that of the system when they come in front of us. Thank you both for your recommendations. Appreciate it. Thank you to the chair.
Thank you. Representative DeFranco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple questions about documentation. What types of documentation would you expect to see for food, travel, hotels, things like that? Is it just a receipt or is there anything beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say receipts, invoices, travel authorizations, or anything else that would be submitted that would support the purpose of it. Like if you're hosting an event, that you would want to have some record of what was going on so we can determine the appropriateness of the purchase.
And would you say that those were what percentage of those were included in these in your evaluation? Was there a large percentage of charges not documented in that way?
There are definitely a lot of instances, I don't know what the percentage is off the top of my head, of simply missing receipts, missing invoices, or things that we felt were not adequately documented in a way that we could determine the appropriateness or in some cases the purpose of a purchase. Can definitely provide a percentage.
No, that's fine. I got it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Are there any other questions from members of the committee? Representative Weir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one. I'll try to formulate this as best I can. In page 3 of your report, in the background, talks about the purchasing policy and the purchasing card policy and procedure manual. And there's just a brief paragraph in talking about what's required for adequate documentation, receipts, invoices, and that sort of thing. But I also note that the chancellor didn't really break. It appears that didn't break policy. And is that only because he has the discretion to override financial controls that are put in place? Is that, if not for his discretion, would he have been breaking laws or?
I'm going to let them answer, but just want to let you know, there is a link to that policy within our testimony on the electronic version, so you can see what the parameters of all of that was. But I think it was beyond that. I think issues of documentation were the main issues that I think that we encountered, and elements of that documentation. So the purpose of the expenditure, in a case of meals, if he would, the list of the attendees were not always there. So those were kind of the issues. And then obviously you need to document this for a state purpose. So there were like certain meal receipts that didn't necessarily, they could have been for a state purpose, but they didn't necessarily, there was nothing to provide evidence to that effect.
So from my understanding from your question, they have a signature matrix that they use that has the different dollar amounts and the authorizations that are required for those types of purchases. The only, as it was explained to us, the chancellor has the ability to go above the $50 meal limit. I'm not under the assumption that he's able to Any of the other rules wouldn't apply. That's the only thing that I'm aware of, that he would still need to provide receipts for purchases. That's not a negotiable. The only ability he has is to exceed the $50 limit, is how we understood it.
Thank you. So just to follow up and clarification, so if this same type of behavior was exhibited by any other employee, by a teacher, a professor, the same rules would apply. The chancellor does not have special dispensation or the ability to override these same policies at his discretion.
The P card policy does allow for, if I remember, senior leadership to override the $50 limit at their discretion. But at the same time, I believe during our review, we did note that the policy is a little bit unclear on when that's acceptable. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Again, I think just from our understanding when we were doing our review, it was mostly related to the meals, and he had the authorization. He didn't need pre-approval if he was out to dinner and it's going to exceed $50. He had the authority to go above those limits.
And I would say we would concur with the comptroller that, we're big on separation of duties in our world. The second sign off would be appropriate if you anticipate that.
Thank you, Representative Weir. Representative Gucker.
Thank you. So what I'm kind of gathering from all of this is there's not any obvious wrongdoing. It's more about clarity, and it's more about maybe we need to work on defining these things moreover. In other words, stating that, okay, if we're going to go above the discretionary amount, what are the parameters around that? What are we allowing to do? We're also looking at, maybe having to go over and look at this manual for signing on to the P card program, clarifying that so that all sides maybe have a better understanding of what is allowed and what is not allowed, so that we don't find ourselves in this position. Would you concur that that may be a good starting point?
Yeah, I would say that that's accurate, as more clarity is probably necessary.
Thank you. Representative Dathan.
Uh-oh.
My last question, I promise. In your report, you say the CSCU Board of Regents Audit Committee is charged with conducting an annual review of the president, now chancellor's, expenses as stipulated in its charter. Did you see any evidence of that in your limited procedure audit?
I had requested those audit reports several times, and I was never provided copies, so I can't say anything more than just the initial request, follow-ups, and I never saw any evidence of them.
Okay, so in previous administrations, were those part of your audit process, that you would be looking at the review of the chancellor president's audit committee reports?
I can't say 100% sure of what we've actually looked at in the past. I could get back to you on that, but as part of our normal audits, we do look at any other outside auditor reports or any internal reports that they have. We always try to review those to see if there's anything that, we should be testing further.
So Grant Thornton did some review as well. Did you look at that as part of your procedures here?
We would not as part of this review, but as our normal departmental compliance audits, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And seeing no additional questions, I want to thank you for appearing before us today. We appreciate it. Like I said to the State Comptroller, we have a public hearing in the Higher Education Committee on a specific piece of legislation with respect to correcting some of the errors in state policy, perhaps that we could feel like we could strengthen. We'll certainly look at your recommendations as we're reviewing that legislation. But I would also sort of ask you if you have any comment now, or if you can provide some additional written testimony specifically about that legislation, to see if that there are thoughts that you might have about how to make that legislation stronger after the public hearing before we pass it out of our committee. So I would encourage you and invite you to do that.
We'd
Okay.
be happy to.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much for joining us today. All right. Next up is our panel from the CSCU, and Chancellor Chang is here. I think he's going to bring 3 other folks up. I'll let him introduce those folks, and we look forward to hearing from you today. Thank you for being here. And I apologize for the noise that seems to suddenly start coming out of the ventilation system. I don't know how that, it's not very loud, but it's a little distracting. That's what happens when you are in an aging building, I guess. So Chancellor Chang, thank you for being here. And I don't know if you have any opening remarks. I suspect you do. We'd be glad to hear them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Slapp, Representative Haddad, Senator Martin, Representative Bronco, and other esteemed members of the Higher Education and Employment Advancement Committee, and Senator Gadkar Wilcox, Representative Dathan, Senator Sampson, Representative Carney, and other esteemed members of the Government Oversight Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to address these matters. As Chancellor of the Connecticut State Colleges and University System, I have served our students, faculty, staff, and institutions to the best of my abilities. However, I acknowledge that my actions have raised serious concerns about financial oversight and transparency. This has caused frustration and has diverted attention from what matters the most, the success of our students and our institutions. And for this, I take personal responsibility, and I am extremely, extremely sorry. I also want to apologize to the members of the General Assembly who have consistently supported our system and its students. I know that this is not the conversation you want to have about CSCU. And for my part in this, I do sincerely apologize. We recognize the need for stronger oversight, clearer policies, and better training to enhance accountability and transparency. The work of the State Comptroller and the APA has made that more than abundantly clear. And I want to thank Comptroller Sean Scanlon and his team and the Auditors of Public Accounts for providing these recommendations that will help us to implement stricter controls and clearer guidelines across the system. We appreciate their guidance and attention, and we have been working diligently with them to provide information, but also to strengthen our policies and our internal controls. Since this matter came to our attention in a very public way, of course, we have been working very hard to make those improvements in real time as much as possible. We're actively developing new system-wide policies for P cards and travel. We are ensuring stricter controls, clearer guidance, and reinforcing accountabilities at all levels. That includes me and my office. I am pleased to report that a new centralized P card policy will be presented to the Board of Regents for approval as early as the end of this month, with a planned effective date of April 1, 2025. We have also established a dedicated policy committee tasked with reviewing, revising, recommending, and implementing the Board of Regents' adopted system-wide policies to ensure consistency and compliance. This committee is chaired by our new Chief Compliance Officer and comprised of institutional representatives designated by their respective presidents and system office staff, which serve as subject matter experts. This committee's core function is to identify and eliminate policy gaps that may pose risks to financial integrity and operational efficiency. Additionally, we are working to improve financial reporting, strengthen compliance measures, and ensure greater transparency. We are committed to establishing oversight mechanisms to reinforce financial integrity and prevent any future missteps. I recognize that trust is not just given. It has to be earned through action, and it cannot be earned simply through words. I am fully committed, personally and professionally, to rebuilding trust and confidence in our system and in my leadership among all of our stakeholders. As has been noted, this is not what our faculty, our staff, our students, our taxpayers, our legislature deserve. Our students across CSCU are the most important investment I believe we can make. Moving forward, our collective focus must remain on supporting their future by ensuring that they receive an affordable, high-quality education in a system that operates with integrity, transparency, and accountability. Again, I want to thank you for your time and for the opportunity to address you and to answer your questions. Now I want to introduce the team that is with me. We have Karen Buffkin. She is our CSCU General Counsel. Cameron Liston, he is our Chief Compliance Officer. And Lloyd Blanchard, he is our Vice President for Finance and Administration. Their work and our team's work across the system is going to increase accountability and transparency and tighten controls. Thank you for the ability to make those remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chancellor. I appreciate your statement. I think that there is a lot of frustration here about this issue. I was personally surprised at the findings initially in the article and then subsequently in the other two reports, because we worked very hard to sort of maintain a system that is puts students first. Representative Gooker earlier said, maybe there's nothing sort of technically wrong here, or no violation of policy or on law. Looks like some policies may have been not fully complied with, but I think that to some extent that's besides the point, right? Your system faces serious, financial challenges. And it should go without saying that some of the expenses and some of the expenditures were sort of eyebrow raising to many of us here. And I'm glad to hear that the board is taking seriously its role to try to sort of curtail that stuff. I also want to put this in context, which is even more, a little bit more frustrating to me, because I arrived here in 2011. That was 14 years ago. And in that time, like this is not the first time we've had these conversations with folks at the Board of Regents and its leadership. We might remember the unauthorized pay increases that were granted by then President Kennedy, who approved $250,000 of increases to staff without prior board approval. That was way back in 2012. That was followed by President Gray, who spent $1.9 million on a plan that was subsequently scrapped. We have other examples now. We're learning that in 2017, the internal audit team was disbanded, which I guess was reactive to a certain budget considerations in 2017. It was a difficult year, but just turns out to be, a terrible decision. All of that was prior to your tenure, and it just seems like this system has not quite found its footing yet. Senator Slapp asked a question earlier about culture, and I'll just say this is a tall order. This is a system that has, to my mind, has never created the culture that we really want to see here, and that is, I think, rooted in our state constitution. We are required here at the General Assembly and in the executive branch to run a system of public higher education that is excellent. I take those words seriously. It's interesting, that the standard isn't just adequate. The Constitution actually requires us to have an excellent system of post-secondary education. And I think we do well to think moving forward about whether, our actions are intentional, and whether or not they meet that constitutional goal. How does this purchase, how does this action, how does this plan further our goal, our constitutionally mandated goal to have a post-secondary system that is excellent? And if it's not, if it doesn't meet that standard, don't do it. If it doesn't look like, if it's not going to make us appear like we're meeting that goal on the front, if that expenditure or that plan or that action is on the front page of the Hartford Current, then don't do it. I think that we might have forgotten that. I'm hopeful that the leadership of the Board of Regents will finally take appropriate action to sort of put the appropriate controls in place. That's what our legislation that we'll be hearing later on does. And to that point, I just want to ask you a question about the transparency.gov and the conveyance of information from your system to the state comptroller's office, because I think transparency will go a long way in helping us resolve some of these issues, and might be the one thing that we can do from here that will help create that culture inside your institutions that will be that we want to see. And that is, so, in 2011, we put in place this statute that requires the systems and the institutions to work with the comptroller and to work with the Office of Policy and Management to make these expenditures as transparent as possible. But I'm confused as to why that statute, as it's currently written, just hasn't worked. What is the hurdle, as you see it, to conveying that information to the comptroller's office and putting that up on transparency.gov so that we're having a conversation 14 years later about why we need to strengthen the mandate and why that hasn't happened already?
Thank you for the question, Representative Haddad. I will ask our General Counsel and our Vice President for Finance and Administration to chime in with the appropriate level of detail. I will tell you that the commitment to transparency, we have to double down on that. I want to say that one of the hardest lessons that I have personally and professionally learned is the misalignment of intent versus impact. So even though I take certain actions on behalf of the system for the betterment of our system with a focus on our students, I have to recognize when I haven't met that bar of excellence, as you pointed out. And I certainly do that. I do that in private, I do that in public, and it's something that I certainly will be held accountable for. And I will continue to stand up and be accountable for that. In relation to what we're talking about with transparency.gov and, let's say, the alignment of our systems towards that shared goal, I'd like to ask General Counsel Karen Buffkin to chime in first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chancellor, and thank you to the committee for today. I'm Karen Buffkin. I'm the relatively new General Counsel for the State University System. I joined on December 2nd, but I have the distinction of having worked for the Office of the Comptroller as their counsel when Core CT was being implemented way back in 2001, 2002. So I do have a little bit of history here. The reason the statute at the time was written that way in part was that the Core CT enterprise system doesn't particularly align with the spending or the financials that are tracked in higher education. As noted, I think I've read UConn's testimony. UConn Health uses Banner. The State University system uses Banner. It is both the student management system as well as our financial system. And I will say historically, other efforts to crosswalk data to the Core CT system is not as simple as it seems. But I will leave that to the financial expert to talk a little bit more about that because there were legacy systems at the time that we needed access to data that needed to be crosswalked, and it isn't a simple fix either. So thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Lloyd Blanchard, Vice President for Administration and Finance. In terms of the transparency question, We do publish our financial statements for all of our institutions online every year. We hold public meetings with our Board of Regents for budget approvals, budget adjustments, as well as new policies and changing policies. All of those meetings are done in public, and all of the information provided, all of the information that we use in those meetings are also provided to the public. Recently, the Board of Regents has called for an accountability report. It's very much like a quarterly report because they wanted to see sort of spending in real time throughout any given fiscal year. Quarterly reports in higher education are a little tricky because we get our revenues twice a year, at the beginning of the fall semester, the beginning of the spring semester. So quarterly doesn't really fit the timing of the reporting that we do traditionally in higher ed. So we designed an accountability report that reports to the board 3 times a year, that after the fall census, so that we can get the information on how many students showed up. Usually that census is done 3 or 4 weeks after the beginning of classes. That's done also in the spring when we have a spring census. But together with the spring census, we also do, which we will do here next week, a mid-year report, which shows our updated projections for the fiscal year, showing how revenues have changed as well as how spending have changed. I think some of the recommendations made by the Office of the State Controller as well as the auditors of the public accounts, I thought those recommendations are good, some of which we've already put in place, some of which we are putting in place, and others that we can continue to wrestle with in terms of how do we transition information from our financial system and Banner to Core CT. One of the challenges of doing so is that our financial systems are very much linked to our student records. Our student records that starts from their applications to their admissions, to receiving their financial aid, to the classes that they take. And so our financial system is reconciled with that, mainly as it relates to the assessment of their financial aid need and whatever needs we need to make with financial aid. So in terms of transparency, we certainly are in support of providing greater transparency to the citizens of Connecticut because we do believe in being good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So we're looking forward to working with this body as well as other agencies to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. I just want to follow up on that, though, and I just want to make sure I understand. I guess I had imagined that every expenditure that was made by in your system could be exported into a file and sent over this is my simple version, I guess, the comptroller's office, who could then sort of add that to the expenditure list that they have. I take from your last remark that perhaps some of those payments or some of those expenditures are to students, and that it might be protected by federal privacy guidelines. And so the question, I guess, is for you is it possible to export that data and simultaneously redact student, that has to be redacted for student privacy purposes? I mean, am I understanding that is one of the more significant hurdles to sort of sharing those expenditures with the rest of with the comptroller system?
Federal law that we often refer to as FERPA does protect student records strongly. And we spend a lot of our time making sure that we are in compliance with that law, mainly because Title IV dollars, financial aid dollars from the federal government, are implicated with violations of such policies. So I'm not exactly sure exactly how they interface with the challenge of providing expenditure data to the controller, but I suspect that all of our expenditures do not have student names attached to them. And so I think as we work with the state controller, we can identify those expenditures that can be shared and those that would violate FERPA.
Thank you. I'm going to see if others have questions. Representative Dathan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for presenting. I love seeing your students on our appropriations day,
Yeah.
and they really are a true testament of how wonderful the CSCU system is. And it's something that we as a state should be proud of. I guess, I look at some of your comments and, they are settling to say, okay, we're looking at this and we're trying to gain back trust of our community and our state. Um, but I'm still kind of concerned about the students who don't even have access to food pantries at some of the locations. And we're talking about excessive meals here. What sort of message do you think that that gives the student who's working several jobs and trying to make ends meet and trying to get food from a food pantry and can't get it? And, there's excessive meals happening at the top. What sort of tone do you think that sets?
I think it looks bad. I mean, I'm not sure how else to say it more elegantly than that. And that is certainly something that I have to own as the leader of this system. When I make a mistake, I fess up to that mistake. Those were mistakes. Those were absolutely mistakes in that I did not take into consideration what the public perception of my actions might have been. So again, when I am doing what is a part of my job, which is to try to cultivate relationships and establish partnerships and to give statewide our leaders are in the communities or in businesses and industries um, information and to try to create bridges for more opportunities for our students. In doing that, I did not consider what the perception would be like, especially for those students that you mentioned. And so um, I own up to those misjudgments, because there was no nefarious intent. And I can vow that I will not make those mistakes again. I simply will not make those mistakes again. And I say that in public, in testimony, and that is something that, again, I will be held accountable for, because ultimately, if we don't have trust, and if I, as the leader of this organization, don't have trust with you as our legislative leaders, if I don't have trust with my board, and if I don't have trust with our students and our faculty and staff, then we're never going to make the progress that we must make for our students, for our people, and for the state. And so I take that very seriously. And so again, at this time, you have my commitment in words, but I hope you will continue to see through our actions that we are firmly, firmly focused on that.
Thank you. I appreciate the actions that you're looking at taking, and I would love an opportunity to see the progress of these things, post our legislative session and see where we are with all of these. You've talked about doubling down and making sure that, we have our intent versus impact out there. But just, and again, this is some of the press articles I read. I see, lots of delays in responding to requests, whether they're formal FOIA requests or other requests that the auditors made, for example, and they weren't. How do we kind of balance those two items? Because, your words are saying one thing, but we haven't seen it so far in practice in regards to documents that were requested.
Thank you for the question, Representative. I will tell you that our office, multiple offices, did everything they could to ultimately gather all of the information that was requested of our system through FOI, through the comptroller's audit, and through the APA's review. We complied with the FOI in as timely a manner as we possibly could. And we also worked very closely and as diligently as we could with the state comptrollers, and ultimately with the APA. We provided the information that we had, and that there was additional information. Apparently, there was a misalignment of expectations or understanding of what all the information actually is comprised of. If I may, I would like to ask General Counsel Karen Buffkin to just add a bit to that in terms of our compliance with these requests and our delivery of the information.
Certainly. Thank you, Chancellor Cheng. I began working on this matter as well after I joined the office, and we worked both with the Comptroller's Office and with the Auditors of Public Accounts. The Comptroller was working off of a request by the governor for a review. Before that report was issued, we asked to be able to get a preview of it and to see what the recommendations were so that we could ensure that the understanding was correct and that we could determine whether or not there was any missing information. We were not provided the report in advance, and none of that was able to be completed. So there are instances where we think there may be, additional information that would provide more clarity to that situation. Similarly, with the Auditors of Public Accounts, we asked if we normally in an audit, when they're doing an audit at an agency and they say, we reviewed 10 instances and 5 of these had irregularities. You can ask them, could you give me the 5, let's say it's an employee record. Can you give me the 5 instances so that we can go back and check our records, make sure that, you have everything you need, or we can provide you an explanation as to what occurred. We asked similarly at that point in time because we became aware that we thought that the Auditors of Public Accounts did not have all of our records. Understanding that during this period of time, we were answering multiple FOI requests. We were working in real time to provide timely information to the Comptroller's Office as well as the Auditors of Public Accounts. And we determined that they may not have all of the records that we had that were in a separate office. We asked to see their recommendations. We'd gotten a summary, but to break it down for us so that we could provide some additional information. Because it was a review, not an audit, they said that that was not part of the practice. So we did not have that opportunity up front. We did subsequently send all of that information to the auditors so that they would have what we had. And I can tell you, for instance, the clothing that was purchased, that was an education that would come under the education spending. It was a competition with our community college students who were screen printing, logos on shirts as part of a competition, as one example of a portion of that spending. So there were, and perhaps the right notes weren't put on the thing, on the documents that went there, but they were in fact shirts. But those were for use by the students in a competition. And I hope that
I understand. Sorry, I understand. It sounded to me from when the auditors spoke, they still hadn't received those items, and that's like 30% of their audit selection were not received. In addition, we talk about and I mentioned it before, the CSCU Board of Regents Audit Committee is charged with conducting an annual review of the president's, now chancellor's, expenses as stipulated in the charter. When do those annual reviews happen? And I'm assuming they're after year end as part of the sort of annual procedures. And have those records been made available to the auditors? That's probably a question for your CFO.
Actually, I worked with Rebecca Balkin on that, as well as the chief of staff. And what the process was when the question came to us was to go to the board records to look for those, and to determine whether or not that had been done. The last time it was done was at the end of Greg Gray's presidency in 2015. So we couldn't find no record, and I went so far as to call a number of individuals who worked in the intervening years to try to determine what happened and why was that not occurring during that period of time, because it went back 6 years prior to the current chancellor's tenure. There seems to have been a changeover in staff, and in 2020 people went out for COVID, and so things apparently, somewhere got lost in translation as staff changed roles. The 2024 review of the chancellor's expenditures will be conducted by the audit committee.
So it wasn't an annual per the charter, it's once a decade, sounds like. Yeah, it hasn't been done since 2015?
I'm sorry, I'll let
Okay.
the CFO answer that. And we even checked to see if it was informally done and just not, but we could find no specific record.
The general counsel is correct as it relates to the chancellor's records and the requirement to monitor the chancellor's records. But as it relates to the audit committee's work generally, they do meet every year to review the financial statements when they are ready to be published, as the audit committee will here in the next few days.
Yeah, I mean, just, as a former auditor, we talk a lot about risk assessment and, where we are to mitigate risks. And, we talk about some of these things here about policies and plans you have in place, but if there is no oversight or if there's no sort of review that, there is oversight over this, it, isn't sure if it's going to happen. If you have things in your charter, but they're not adhered to, how are we going to feel comfortable that these other oversight mechanisms that you're putting in place are actually going to happen if they haven't happened historically? Just kind of stating that and just to kind of conclude I could go on for a while, but I'm not going to. I've been a CFO of small companies, and when I give credit cards to employees within the company, obviously they sign all of the policies and procedures, and that's part of the, acceptance of the terms. We have mechanisms in place that if there isn't adequate receipts for something, how you can deal with those, and those comply with IRS regulations. There are really a tone that I say to people when I give a card. I say, this is like you're spending your money. And we as taxpayers of Connecticut, that is very, very true. And any sort of spending that is done that is outside of sort of norms affects our student outcomes. And, I look at some of these expenses that are reported, and it gets me concerned. And again, going back to the message. So, I am hopeful that we will see some improvement. I'm looking forward to meeting with you in the coming months to see how it's coming along. But I'm sure that this is going to be an ongoing discussion and a lot of concern for a lot of people. And, Chancellor, you've done a great job with the students in terms of what, the CSCU people are very, the outcomes are getting there. We're seeing evidence of it, but, we need to have full, complete confidence in the system and how we're going to manage that and control sort of these sort of issues. So thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Dathan. Senator Gedkar Wilcox.
Thank you so much. First, thank you, Chancellor Chang, for being here and for acknowledging these actions. And it's not a difficult place it's not an easy place to be. It's sort of difficult to do that. So appreciate you being here and acknowledging the impact of that. And that's one of the things I wanted to focus on, because as you mentioned yourself, this has become a distraction from what is really the most important thing we have to be focused on, is the students. And it's also distracting from what has been going on probably every day for the last several weeks. Faculty members have been advocating, meeting with legislators to try to get every single dollar that is available possible to get that to students. And they've been working so hard at doing that. And this in a way now distracts from that and raises questions of, well, do they really need this funding? What funding, when in fact they don't even have the funding they need now? So what my question is, one, I worry about this getting mixed in, and that perception and the public perception about overall sort of management of finances and the needs of the schools. But what steps then can be taken to ensure that advocacy and that work continues? Because that has been consistent.
Yes.
And, as Representative Dathan said, the students are just absolutely amazing. The faculty members are amazing in the amount of work they're doing. They're always they have been under-resourced and require that support. So what steps can we take to make sure that advocacy is separate from this, and that we're providing that support to the extent possible.
Senator, thank you for the comments and the question, because the acknowledgement of our faculty and our staff and our collective bargaining partners cannot be understated. They are here in the building, as they say, every single day. They're making the phone calls, they are having the meetings, and they represent us with pride and with dignity. And I can't thank them enough for all that they do, not just inside the classroom, obviously, but here in the building and outside the classroom as well. So they're some of our best advocates. And I can only repeat that I apologize, and I feel awful that my actions have taken focus away from that work. It has taken focus away from helping our students. So if it is possible, and we will work very hard in my office and I personally to not only model, but then to demonstrate that there are policies, to show that there is unity with our Board of Regents, to show that there is accountability in our public meetings, in our sharing of information, and to basically keep showing over and over again that there is only one version of the story. It's the truth. And any information that we can provide to reaffirm that truth, we are certainly going to do that. And hopefully, any of the mistakes that I or our leaders might make, because at the end of the day, we are human, I hope that can be disaggregated from the totality of value and impact that our students, our faculty, and our staff bring to this state and to these communities every single day. They should not be disrupted, and they should not shoulder even more burden for mistakes that I have made. And again, all I can do is continue to try to bring more trust by creating more value and opportunity for them. And hopefully in time, we will be able to move beyond that and fully dedicate our attention to the great work our faculty, staff, and our students are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Quick question for you, and then I believe Representative Ferrari, you're on deck. And I think my co-chair is checking about the timing here because we have a public hearing that I believe we have to begin at 1:45. So anyways, we'll have an update on that. But thank you for being here, and I respect your your contrition, and there's that saying "mess up, fess up," and just kind of I greatly respect your candor, and I know that you care about the students and about your the mission. I believe that. I know that from our many conversations over the years. I think changing the policies, that's pretty easy stuff, actually, right? Some of the policies are already in place, right? And they're just being ignored, right? And we can change them and improve them. But changing the culture is more difficult.
Yes.
Right? And I believe that there's a culture problem. And I want to ask you that if you also believe that. And it's not, in fairness to you and your office, it's not just, there limited, right, to central office. If you look at other campuses, leaders at other campuses, it's the expensive meal when Chipotle would have been fine, right? It's the maybe the room service when going downstairs to the restaurant would have been fine. It's the pervasive sloppy bookkeeping, right, that we see again at many campuses in the system. So my question is, do you agree that there's a cultural problem with it when it comes to the system and, leaders in the system, maybe, thinking that they're at, a very wealthy school in New Haven with a $32 billion endowment and sitting in the ivory tower, and this is not that, right? So is there a cultural problem? And if so, what can you do? What will you do to change it? Because again, that's harder than changing the policies. And it's not with you. Like, I believe you, right? You're going to, whatever you're going to be crossing the T's and dotting the I's. I think we know that, but I think it's more pervasive. So what can you do as a leader of the system to change that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I'm going to try to provide an honest, potentially dissatisfying answer, but I'm going to give you my truth in this. I would argue that we in the system actually have a pretty responsible culture when it goes across the system, right? And day to day on campuses, we're literally having conversations about, we could serve this kind of breakfast at a legislative session, but we have to look at the budget, right? Or a legislative breakfast, but we have to look at the budget, right? Well, we could provide, sandwiches, but maybe a few tubs of ice cream for this student affairs event is better. I mean, there are folks on the ground, on the campuses, who take their fiduciary responsibility incredibly seriously, as do we as well. Again, my misjudgments, our misalignments, I hope are not ultimately albatross that have to be carried by our rank and file day-to-day people on the grounds. To your point about culture, though, Senator, I would be lying if I did not say that there is an endemic quality to how we have potentially done business in certain offices for quite some time, where we were not as fastidious, we were not as detail oriented, we just didn't take certain protocols seriously enough. And yes, does that predate my arrival as chancellor? It does. Does that matter? Absolutely not. Because the concern and the challenge and the problem is here now, and it is our responsibility and it is my responsibility to ensure that we are doing something about it. And that starts with me, right? Again, that has to start with me. What do I do to make sure that I am not viewed or considered above anything or anyone? At the end of the day, the highest person in the organization is also the highest level of servant to the organization. And that's how I view this. And so I must serve our folks the way they deserve to be through transparency and accountability. But that also means in my position of influence across the system, I must also take that accountability through multiple areas and multiple levels. That too, again, comes back to the chancellor's office, and it does come back to the board as well. So we have to have the will to manage. I do not think historically in higher education, because there has been a kind of boon of enrollment from multiple generations going back to World War II, where folks you opened the doors to higher education, people came and enrolled. It's not like that anymore, right? And so we have to really mind crossing the T's and dotting the I's more. So again, I caveated this by saying that's probably a somewhat dissatisfying answer, but the reality is there is a culture that we have to address. We have to address it head on. We have to address it ruthlessly, because if we don't do that, we will never earn back the trust. And that is something that I'm firmly committed to.
Thank you. I'll tell you what's going to happen now. It is 1:33. This is roughly the start time for the public hearing on the legislation that in part it considers the same issue. But we have, I think, one, maybe two more members of the Government Oversight Committee who will request to ask a question. So I'm going to ask any other member of the Government Oversight, again, we're calling Representative Gucker, but if there's any other member from that committee who wants to ask a question during this forum period of the time, to ask your question now. At the conclusion of those questions, we will end the public forum and start our public hearing. You're coincidentally are the first three or four folks signed up on at the public hearing. So we'll just let the higher education committee members ask their questions there. But as before, we intend to take any written testimony and many of your comments into consideration as we move forward to the public hearing. And so with that, Representative Gucker.
Try to be really quick because we're under time constraints here. As not only a product of the system, but a supporter, I do recognize the tough work that you have, and I've attended many of your events and continue to volunteer for events at Western, but since it's my alma mater. I think it would be helpful as we stave off a lot of the negative letters that come to us demanding some sort of retribution, which I don't think retribution is the way. I think finding a source on how to fix and repair and move on in a positive way is a better way to go. I think it would be helpful when we look at things such as the little chart with with your spending. It makes it look like you've gone out to the Riviera and spent all this money having having a wonderful time, when I'm guessing it's moreover about lobbying for the system and working with and going to various organizations that, even though it looks like $19,000, it was $200 here and $100 here and $500 there, or whatever it may be. That maybe as we go forward with this, clarifying some of that to show the public that this isn't extravagant spending. This is the course of doing business at multiple events. So maybe breaking that down so it doesn't look like a massive thing, but moreover, advocating, lobbying, and promoting of our system. I think that would go a long way to not only helping us be able to navigate a lot of the negative publicity, but at the same time clarifying and showing that you are indeed working for the betterment of the university system. Just my little 2 cents. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And are there any final questions from members of government oversight? I'm going to look at Representative Dathan and Representative Carney. Seeing none, then we're going to close the forum. Folks who are online, if you want to stay with us, you have to find the YouTube feed for higher education. And this Zoom call will also change to a different link. And so we'll pause, I think maybe just for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'll call the higher education public hearing to order.